Perfect. Thanks very much, Will. Thank you very much to the project for inviting me. First of all, I want to make two comments at the beginning. I'm going to be talking about the medium and larger mammals from a couple of expeditions, and I'll talk more about when those took place. These are sometimes referred to as the poster children of sort of projects like this, because the animals that everybody wants to see, and these charismatic species. But as you'll see as the talk goes on, they're probably not as interesting, certainly not as interesting as things like the birds, the small mammals, and definitely not the reptiles, Will. So you'll be pleased to hear that. But I also want to say that I'm a bit more of a face, a bald-headed face to this. The vast majority of this work has been done by my co-authors who are listed over there. As we've heard over the course of this morning, I hope this is going to work. Is it not?
Let's click on this.
There we go. Perfect. That Angola has a rich mammalian fauna, and there's a number of reasons for this. Brian touched on it this morning. Peter Taylor is going to talk a little bit more immediately after me, and I know he's going to touch on it then. We also know that the Civil War has certainly had an effect on the larger mammals. The status of some of the larger mammals is fairly uncertain. We know this. And there's also, as Steve alluded to, in fact didn't allude to, he showed quite graphically this morning that there are current threats to the mammals in the form of bushmeat and the development of certain parts of Angola, people utilizing mammals. They're rather tasty. So this part of the project was geared towards having a look at what's out there, really. In terms of the larger mammals, I've very arbitrarily defined them as the mammals that are larger than a kilogram. In fact, we did catch a few more on the camera traps that were slightly smaller, but Peter's going to talk about the small mammals in a moment. So I'm really going to restrict this talk to the larger mammals that were recorded in part of the core study area. So the data that I'm going to talk about is restricted to the 2016 expeditions at this point, and it included opportunistic or verified sightings and two more formal camera trap surveys. So just to stop there for a moment, the opportunistic sightings included both sightings from the team whilst they were on the expeditions, and then some camera traps that were handed out to safari operators and so on in the area, and other sightings like that. The camera traps, in terms of some of the specifics, the first survey ran between February and March for about 940 trap nights, and then the second one from July to November, slightly more trap nights there. And if we zoom in to those transects, the first survey was conducted in two transects, one orientated this way, one orientated that way, with the camera traps placed about 2 to 3 kilometers apart, I think roughly, Goods, I hope. Yeah. And then the second survey was slightly further south, where the camera traps are along similar sorts of lines, but they're a little bit more sort of further apart. And for those of you who haven't seen camera traps and hearing me talking about these things called camera traps, that's what they look like. These are the three models that were used on the project: two Cuddyback brands, and then a trophy camera, a Bushnell trophy cam. And these were mounted, that's a different brand, don't worry about that, that's one of mine. Mounted about 30 centimeters onto a tree or post to try and capture as many species as possible, mammal species and other things, as you saw from the photographs earlier this morning, and to try and pick up what was present in the area. Now, I mentioned that these are, whilst they might be the poster mammals of bigger projects, they, from a biodiversity point of view, are not terribly exciting. Over this survey, 35 species from 17 families were recorded, which is pretty cool. It's not 100 and something and however many undescribed species, as you'll see in a moment. But if we just separate out the two types of methods, or the two methods that we used during this particular survey, we can start to see, as we would expect, that some species were recorded by both methods, so the opportunistic sightings and the camera traps, and there were 10 species that the camera traps and the sightings picked up. Here are 4 of them: common duiker, large spotted genet, the honey badger, and a side-striped jackal over there, which looks more like a dog than anything else, but it's a side-striped jackal. 10 species recorded by both techniques, 11 recorded by the camera traps only. So the camera traps, certainly as they were designed to do, are able to pick up species that are a little bit more cryptic. And here are some of those species that were only picked up by the camera traps. Things like caracal, wildcat, aardvark, springhare, and then there's $100 to Peter or Woody if they can identify the bat that's lurking in the photograph over there. So they can record bats, but I think that's a rarity. Definitely not going to be able to identify. The majority of the species that were captured by the camera traps only were nocturnal, and we would expect that from a camera trapping point of view. That's where camera traps do very, very well. In terms of the species that were only recorded by the sightings, opportunistic sightings, there were 5 species. Steve alluded to some of these earlier this morning. These included things like oribi, elephant, only the sign, roan, lechwe, and sitatunga. It's a little bit misleading because some of these were actually recorded on camera traps, but they weren't the camera traps that were used in the transect, so we've separated them out. So in fact, they were recorded on camera trap, but it's part of the opportunistic sightings category. In terms of what was recorded or photographed the most, it was these 2 species across the 2 sessions: large spotted genet, common duiker. It's what I would expect from a camera trapping point of view, species that are relatively territorial. Certainly the duiker is. I'm not too sure about large spotted genet being highly territorial, but that seems to be the case. If you put a camera trap in an area where there's a species that is highly territorial, you'll pick up lots of photographs of it. Then, if we go to all the exciting stuff that the media want to see, the big guys, the large spotted cats. Leopards were the most frequently photographed large carnivore in the camera trapping survey. It's kind of what I'd expect, and I'll talk to that in a moment. But interestingly, they were the most frequently photographed large carnivore, but they were only photographed in the second session of camera trapping in 2016. And there's some images to show you that they are knocking around. And we'd expect leopards, well, I would certainly expect leopards to be a little bit more abundant than other larger carnivores. It's because of their ability to survive in places where food starts to become limiting. They're particularly catholic in their dietary choices, so they can eat anything from a springhare all the way up to, in some cases, large eland. So what did this first kind of stab at looking at the mammals, what can it tell us? First of all, it's an important first step at documenting what's out there, okay, in that part of Angola. And that's important. Steve mentioned this morning how there's some of the first records in areas that haven't been, where they haven't been recorded before, of wild dogs, cheetahs. Absolutely. These are, certainly wild dogs are endangered, and these are some of the first records of a part of southern Africa, I guess you could say southern Africa, where these animals haven't been recorded. And so this is very, very important stuff. So it's an important first step. Interestingly, and Peter will talk more to this in a moment, is that all of the species that we recorded during this first stab at what's out there in terms of the larger mammals have been previously recorded. So there's no brand new, larger mammalian records, and we'd kind of expect that. These are bigger species. It's not going to be as exciting from from that point of view as things like the reptiles and certainly the smaller mammals. So in terms of future work, and this is called future work, but in fact Curlin has been doing some of this already, and so some of this has been taken care of. But certainly what needs to happen from a larger mammal perspective is a greater habitat coverage. That has started to happen. Curlin's been placing cameras out in a much more systematic way, and that'll help for the second point, and that's placing cameras out more systematically so that we can start to understand the ecology of species that are in the area, species that are uniquely identifiable, things like wild dogs, things like leopards. We can start to model their site occupancy so that we can start to overlay layers of environmental variables into the population data or the presence data that we have for some of these species. So that's essentially the future direction I would propose for the larger mammals. And some of this, as I say, has been started already, and certainly the 2017 data is starting to show some really cool things coming through from a larger mammal perspective. And with that, thank you very much.